Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for allowing me to conduct this colloquy with other colleagues who are here as part of the Senate Western Caucus. We are here to speak in favor of the Murkowski resolution and opposing what the Environmental Protection Agency is trying to do in terms of efforts to regulate climate change, because we know that that is a job killer for all Americans. And so I see my colleague, Senator Hatch from Utah, speaking, and I would ask my friend and colleague, I understand you have some new information that you'd like to share with the people of America in this Senate.
Well, I thank my colleague, and I appreciate being here with my two colleagues from Wyoming and also Idaho. Let me just start by saying, by applauding Senator Murkowski for her strong leadership on this issue, and I stand squarely behind her effort. To summarize what has already been laid out today, the EPA has released findings that, 1, human carbon emissions contribute in a significant way to global warming, and 2, that global warming, which has been going on for about 10,000 years now, is an endangerment to humans. The EPA's foundation for its proposal relies on the assumption that both of these findings are true. Madam President, I was sorely disappointed, but not too surprised when I learned that the EPA based its, quote, findings, unquote, almost entirely on the work by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. I have no problem with much of the science produced by IPCC scientists, but I have a real problem with the way that science is summarized by the political leaders at the IPCC and by the conclusions drawn by those same political leaders in the IPCC's summary for policymakers, which is not a science document. And it becomes immediately evident that the EPA relies very heavily on these political summaries and conclusions rather than actual science produced by the IPCC. Because we now have abundant proof that a wide gulf exists between what the science indicates and what the political leaders at the IPCC pretend that it indicates. But I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. Instead, let's listen to what the IPCC scientists themselves are saying about the conclusions the politicians at the IPCC have been selling to policymakers. Here's what Dr. John T. Everett has to say. He was a UN IPCC lead author and expert reviewer and a former National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration senior manager. He says, quote, "It is time for a reality check. Warming is not a big deal and is not a bad thing. The oceans and coastal zones have been far warmer and colder than is projected in the present scenarios of climate change," unquote. Well, there's one of the IPCC's top scientists saying that the warming we are experiencing is not an endangerment. Let's hear another scientist, Dr. Richard Toll. He was an author of 3 full UN IPCC working groups and the director of the Center for Marine and Atmospheric Science. He says, quote, "There is no risk of damage from global warming that would force us to act injudiciously," unquote. As an illustration, he explains that, quote, "warming temperatures will mean that in 2050 there will be about 40,000 fewer deaths in Germany attributable to cold-related illnesses like the flu," unquote. What's that, Mr. President? Here we have another top scientist at the IPCC telling us that warming will actually save lives, not endanger them. Dr. Oliver W. Frauenfeld, a contributing author of the UN IPCC Working Fourth Assessment Report, sends those of us who are policy makers a serious warning. He says, quote, "Only after we identify these factors and determine how they affect one another can we begin to produce accurate models. And only then should we rely on those models to shape policy," unquote. Now, I hope my colleagues in the Senate are listening today, because these UN IPCC scientists are speaking directly to us. Madam President, I wonder at what cost to our economy and our competitiveness will we as policymakers continue to ignore the actual scientists at the IPCC. There is nowhere near a scientific consensus on either one of the EPA's, quote, findings, unquote, that humans are causing warming or that warming is necessarily bad for the environment or for humankind. MIT climate scientist Dr. Richard Lindzen, another IPCC lead author and expert reviewer, dispels the notion that there is a scientific consensus in favor of drastic climate policy. He explains, quote, "One of the things the scientific community is pretty agreed on is those things will have virtually no impact on climate no matter what the models say." So the question is, do you spend trillions of dollars to have no impact? And that seems like a no-brainer, unquote. Another top IPCC scientist and lead author was Dr. John Christie. He explained that the UN IPCC process had become corrupted by politics. He says, quote, "I was at the table with 3 Europeans, and we were having lunch, and they were talking about their role as lead authors. And they were talking about how they were trying to make the report so dramatic that the United States would just have to sign that Kyoto Protocol," unquote. The politicization at the UN was so egregious that Dr. Christopher W. Landsea, UN IPCC author and reviewer, atmospheric scientist, and expert with NOAA's National Hurricane Center, pronounced, quote, "I personally cannot in good faith continue to contribute to a process that I view as being both motivated by preconceived agendas and being scientifically unsound." Now, Madam President, there are many more UN and government scientists who have publicly expressed their professional opinions that the IPCC political projections are overblown and not supported by the science. I've put together a sampling of their quotations in a report called "The UN Climate Scientists Speak Out on Climate Change." It is available for download on my Climate 101 link on my webpage, and I ask unanimous consent that the full report be placed in the record at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Now, I would like to address an issue that has been very carefully ignored by the EPA, and that is the, get this word, benefit that Americans can expect from the EPA's actions. As senators, not many of us are scientists, but each of us is a policymaker. And as policymakers, we are expected to fully analyze the costs and benefits of any proposal that comes before us. The, quote, endangerment, unquote, that the EPA points to is the warming we are supposedly causing. If warming is the, quote, endangerment, unquote, then the benefit is the amount of warming the regulations would avoid. And thanks to the IPCC, we have all the numbers and assumptions we need to be able to determine just how much warming we could avoid for the amount of carbon emissions the EPA can stop. Now, Madam President, let's go on the assumption that the EPA will successfully reduce human CO2 emissions in this country by 83% over the next century. Well, according to the alarmist, and some would say overblown assumptions at the UN IPCC, Americans can expect a cooling benefit of somewhere between 0.07 and 0.2 degrees Celsius after a full 100 years of effort. That's right, Madam President. We're being asked to give up trillions of dollars in economic activity, send all manufacturing activity overseas, give up millions of jobs, and put basic human activities under the control of the EPA, all for the benefit that cannot be measured on a household thermometer after 100 years of sacrifice and pain. Now, the EPA tells us that our human carbon emissions are leading to a general catastrophe. But then we find out that if we do what they say, it will make no real difference. And so I would ask the EPA, the administrator, this question. Have you done a real risk-benefit analysis of these proposed carbon emission regulations? I don't want to hear all the scary scenarios about general global warming. I want to know the actual risks associated with a 0.07 to 0.2 degree decrease in temperature over 100 years, because that's what we're talking about here. That's the analysis I want to see, because when you stack up the astounding costs on the scale against such a tiny benefit, you have the most lopsided and obvious failure of a cost-benefit analysis that I've ever seen. Now, I notice that my other two colleagues are here, and I've gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to, so I'll put the rest of my remarks in the record at this point, and be glad to go back to my two colleagues.
Madam President, that the senator from Utah has made the clear point that the costs are real. The costs of doing this are very real. The benefits, however, are theoretical. So I see my colleague and friend from Idaho here, and I would ask him who elected the Environmental Protection Agency, because we sure know that the American people are against these increased costs for energy and these job-killing regulations.
Thank you very much, Senator Brasso. You're cheating. You've been looking at my notes here over my shoulder, but a well-made point. I come at this whole proposition from a little different way than perhaps a lot of my colleagues do. All of this debate has been about global warming and about whether we should regulate carbon and how we should do that and what have you. But that's not really the issue on this resolution. This resolution is about the separation of powers. The Constitution of this great land that we all took an oath to uphold is very specific in separating the powers of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The Founding Fathers wisely separated the different branches so that none could overpower the other. Now, what are we doing here? The movement by the administration and by the Environmental Protection Agency is to take from the legislative branch the power that belongs to the legislative branch. It's obvious in the debate that's going on here that we have deep differences, which we should have, because this is a major, major policy decision that will affect every single American. It has profound effects on the economy. It has profound effects on the movement of jobs overseas. And these are things that should be debated, and they are things that should be decided by elected persons, not by the people at the EPA who are not elected and who are not answerable to the electorate. Now, when this happens, what you get is a deterioration of the Constitution of this great country. Each of the branches is constantly tugging at the other, attempting to pull power away from the other and attempting to consolidate power within itself. This movement by the EPA to affect policy is one of those power struggles. Every single member of this body should be concerned about the shift of power from this legislative branch to the administrative branch. Now, what's happened here, as everyone can see, is again, it has become polarized. Again, it has become a partisan argument that we should allow the EPA to do this because we can't seem to get it through the legislative branch as quickly or as efficiently or leaning to the left like we want it. That's wrong. It is just plain wrong. It should be decided right here. Those policy decisions should be debated here. Those policy decisions should be made on the floor of this body and on the body of the House of Representatives, on the floor of the body of the House of Representatives. This is not a job for non-elected persons. It is a job for the people who have been elected and who have to go home again and face re-election and listen to the voters say, you did a great job controlling global warming, or you doofuses, what are you doing? You can't possibly do it the way you want to do it. That is a debate that should be held here. So, why has this become so partisan? At the end of the day, we all know how this is going to come out. There's going to be 55 votes, give or take a couple, to defeat Senator Murkowski's resolution. And it's going to be on generally a party line basis. And at the end, the administration will claim a great and glorious victory again. But it won't be a great and glorious victory for the American people. It will be a defeat for the American people. And more importantly, it will be a defeat and another erosion of the Constitution of this great country and movement of power from the legislative branch, where it belongs, to the administrative branch, to the bureaucrats, to the people who are not elected. That's a wrong way to do this. It should stay right here in the legislative body. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield the floor back to my good friend, Senator Barrasso.
Well, I think you make a very key point. And my colleague from Idaho and I have previously been discussing what's going on and what's been described as the worst environmental disaster in American history, and it's what's happening right today in the Gulf of Mexico. And should the Environmental Protection Agency maybe be focusing its efforts there, where we know there's a real problem, a real job to be done, real concerns, and the American people are looking? Or should the Environmental Protection Agency spend its time, spend our resources driving up the cost of energy and doing it at the idea that perhaps 100 years from now, it might make a difference? The efforts ought to be placed today where the effort is needed most. The Environmental Protection Agency ought to be focused on the Gulf, not on something that theoretically may make a difference 100 years from now. And at a time when emissions are going up in China and going up in India and going up in Russia, going up all around the world, the Environmental Protection Agency says, I want to handcuff the American economy, handcuff the small businesses of this country. At a time with 9.7% unemployment, let's make it tougher on Americans. That's what the Environmental Protection Agency wants to do. And if this Senate goes ahead and defeats the Murkowski amendment, they will be saying exactly the same thing. We're going to make it tougher on small businesses. Now, for the small businesses in the western part of the country, we have our small refiners, we have our agriculture folks, we have tourism folks, all of the different people as part of the Western Caucus. What is this impact going to do to you? What is your position? So we contacted agriculture groups all around the West. Look at this map of the United States. More than half of the square miles of the United States included in here support the Murkowski resolution because they know it's key to their economy. It is key to those parts of the country. It's key to agriculture. It's key to energy production. And it is key to families who are trying to balance their budgets, live within their means. They do not want to see an increase in taxes, which is what this is, an increase in energy costs at a time with 9.7% unemployment. So I would tell you I am here to support the Murkowski resolution of disapproval. The EPA's endangerment finding starts the process of taxing everything Americans do. Driving cars, heating homes, powering small businesses, and this will cost millions of Americans their jobs. Now, it is fascinating. You know, the Small Business Administration wrote to the EPA a couple of times, reminding the Environmental Protection Agency to stop the endangerment finding and look at its impact on small businesses, on small communities. The SBA basically said, comply with the Regulatory Flexibility Act. The law meant to protect small businesses from excessive regulation from Washington. Well, I will tell you, when you talk about excessive regulations from Washington, we have seen them in the last year and a half. This bedrock law was meant to protect the ranchers, the small refiners around the states, restaurant owners in Utah, dairy farmers, you name it. But with unemployment hovering about 9.7%, to me it is unacceptable that the Environmental Protection Agency has failed to evaluate the impact of greenhouse gas regulations on the small businesses and the communities across America. Who grows jobs in America? Small business. In the last 15 years, small business owners have been responsible for 64% of all job creation in America. But additional regulations, additional rules, additional taxes, it makes it that much harder. And is it going to actually have an impact on the global environment? No, not at all. Not when you take a look at what's happening in China, where their emissions are going to go up every year, all the way through 2050. India's emissions going up. More and more energy being used, and if you want to use energy well, the United States does the best job in using it efficiently. So it just seems that when I go home on weekends to Wyoming, and I'll be there again tomorrow, and I talk to people in various parts of the state, they say, what are they thinking back in Washington? Why are they going to make it harder for us to compete? Why are they going to make it harder for us economically? The food producers in our nation compete globally to sell food products, and they do it in a way where we need to use energy. Agriculture is a hugely energy-intense operation, and anything that increases the costs of producing that food is going to get passed on to consumers in this country and consumers in other nations as we go ahead and try to compete and sell our products overseas. It does seem that this EPA endangerment rule will ruin the small business job engine that drives the economy on jobs.
Expired.
Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.